Well, let me greet you once again, and I would remind you I'm in the first book of John, first epistle of John, and I'm using the King James Version. We dealt with a lot last time, but and you do need to follow this thing through, and we now come to chapter 3, but just at this point, I want to remind you who this John really is. Yes, he was one of the closer disciples with Jesus, and this does come out, I think, particularly in this chapter. He was the one who was leaning on the breast of Jesus. He was with Peter and James on the Mount of Transfiguration. He is the one to whom Jesus committed his mother. And it's very interesting because this John ended up with Mary, the mother of Jesus, in Ephesus. And in fact, the contradiction, of course, there's an awful lot of contradictions in so-called religious history, because when you are in Jerusalem, near the Garden of Gethsemane, you see the supposed tomb of Mary. Very, very impressive place. But also, if you go to, I've been to Ephesus, of course, and in Ephesus, they also have a tomb of Mary because some think she died there. But to me, what is quite significant, because this John also wrote Revelation on Patmos, and having been to Ephesus, and while I was in Ephesus, I went to Patmos, which is a boat ride, a little bit difficult, but a boat ride out from Ephesus. That's where we went from. So you can understand his link with being exiled into Patmos. But the reason I'm doing this is because in this chapter 3, I think we need to recognize the background of who this Jesus is. Because he starts off by saying something, and the first verse, "Behold, what manner of love the Father has bestowed upon us." It's very interesting because John is now describing something which is a manifestation or a demonstration of the greatness of the love of God, in that we should be called sons of God. So what we're seeing John, of course, who is renowned for his affection, for his love, he's saying that this is a tremendous gift from God, a demonstration of God's love. Now, there are many, many different ways in which we can see God's love demonstrated, but part of that, John's expression of it, is that this incredible love was demonstrated because we were called sons of God. But then, of course, you've got the downside, because in that first verse it says, "Therefore the world doesn't know us because it didn't recognize God." So it doesn't recognize who we are, doesn't recognize that we are not just religious, not just Christians, and there's an awful lot of difference here, which we need to bring out, that we are born again and sons of God. Now, in verse 2, he goes on and says, "Beloved, now we are the sons of God." But it doesn't appear what we shall one day be like. Now, this is something intriguing, and I don't know whether I dare get deeply into this today, not as deeply as I am getting in my own spirit, because he's saying it doesn't appear what we should be like when Christ returns. But we know that when Christ shall appear, we shall be like him, and we shall see him as he is. But you know, I can't get away from the fact that in Genesis, when God is discussing creation, and he actually says, let us create man in our image. Did you get that? And also, the interesting thing is that when the disciples were asking Jesus and saying, you talk about the Father, show us the Father, the response of Jesus is, if you have seen me, you have seen the Father. Very complicated, but therein lies, in my mind, a great deal of thought. So, we understand that when Jesus comes back, we shall be like him, but I think it's not just in appearance. I think it is that our bodies will be like his. I think that's the real essence here, because, as you know, after the resurrection, Jesus appeared in the midst without opening the doors, because he was spirit as well as flesh. Complicated. Verse 3, every man that has this hope of being like Jesus and having an eternal body purifies himself, because the Lord is pure. And if we want to be like him, literally, physically, then we have to have that purity. And this continues on, because in verse 4, whosoever commits sin transgresses also the law. Now, here and in the previous messages I've been dealing with the problem of some of the Jewish converts. In fact, they were uncertain about their relationship to the Jewish law. But Jesus did sum it up quite clearly, that we are not bound by the law. But here, for the sake of these very traditional Jewish converts, he's saying, whoever commits sin also sins against the old Jewish law. That's the Old Testament. For sin is the transgression of the law. Now, verse 5 sums it up in that we know that he was manifested. In other words, he came to take away our sin. Yes, literally, he came because Jesus is sinless. We know that he came to take away our sin, because there is no sin in Christ. And in verse 6, whosoever abides in him doesn't sin.